Well, welcome to the world, or a little bit of the world of Evelyn Underhill. We're doing the Word, obviously, this semester, and the topic chosen for this part of our semester was living the Word. Initially, I think it was a reference to pastoral care, but I've hijacked it and made it Evelyn Underhill. But I want to take us back mentally mentally back to the first talk we had, first teaching session in this semester, where Mark Jennings talked about Jesus as the Word. And I want to add to word voice. In the beginning God created. In the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while the wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And from Psalm 19, the heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through the earth, all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. The point in bringing those two pieces of scripture to you, and I was going to try and play you a bit of a song which I found on YouTube called "The Voice of God." It's quite cool, but I won't play it for you. It was beyond my technological capacity for today. It's just that having this semester as Word, I want to take us into something that I see in Evelyn Underhill, a wordsmith, a writer, a journalist, someone who has spent a lot of time writing lots of words, but doesn't come to Christ, the Word, in any immediate sense. She starts off with a different kind of experience of God, a mystical experience of God, and she journeys from the writing of this book, Mysticism, which she published in 1911, to the publication of this book called Worship. She comes on a huge journey from a theistic place to a Christocentric and then a Trinitarian place. She comes from someone who is totally unimpressed with the Church of England to someone who helps reshape it. So for me, the sense of Jesus as the Word, as Dr. Mark presented it to us at the beginning, I'm wanting to hear a voice behind Jesus, the Word, that comes through. So I'll take you now to this, which is really towards the end of her writings, 1930, or not to the end of her life, but in the middle to late part of the period that we're looking at for her. You have a copy of the letter that this comes from, and there's no clarity about whether or not the Archbishop actually received this letter, Archbishop Lang. We look to the Church to give us an experience of God, mystery, holiness and prayer, which, though it may not solve the antinomies or paradoxes of the natural world, shall lift us to contact with the supernatural and world and minister eternal life. We look to the clergy to help us and direct our spiritual growth. we are seldom satisfied. Her book, Mysticism, presumably came as a result of her desiring something that she had not been able to find in the church about mysticism, but also that she had not been able to find in the writings about mysticism. Through her late teens and right up to the time when she was married in 1907, she visited Europe regularly, usually annually at summer with her mother. She visited Switzerland and Italy and France, and she sometimes went places without her mother as well. In these experiences, in her travelling experiences, she was deeply, deeply connected, felt deeply, deeply connected with the churches, the art in the churches and the art in the galleries, and the liturgy in the churches. And in some of the letters she writes, which I only kind of found later on in the piece in preparing for today, her descriptions of those experiences are quite amazing. And so in all her life, even really just from school time, from 17, when she talked about her life and how she thought her life, when she reflected on her life in a fairly profound way, she began to look for meaning and an understanding of the mystical experiences and all the experiences that she felt in those churches and through the art. She had a pretty strong or rich range of languages she could speak. She could speak Italian and French, or read them, and Latin. She could read Latin. And she began to read quite voraciously. So by 1907, when she is in Italy, she's writing back to her fiancé about house arrangements for their new house, and in another letter within the same week, she's writing to a young person called Margaret Robinson, offering her spiritual direction, advice, and talking about some of the mystics that she's been reading. So she comes from this fairly rich personal education that is a response, I suppose, to her interests and her desire to know more. Throughout the period from 1907 to 1911, she continues writing to Margaret Robinson, who's a Presbyterian, or started off life as a Presbyterian. I don't know that she stayed Presbyterian. About the different books, and encouraging Margaret to read the different books that she was reading, and then eventually asked Margaret's help, because Margaret read German, to help her translate Eckhart and Mechthild of whoever, you know. Sorry, I've lost my script. Mechthild of Magdeburg. And in that period of time, she was writing Mysticism. And Mysticism, when it came out, was a bestseller and went through quite a few editions in a fairly short period of years. She made some changes, but not necessarily to the text so much as to the prefaces, because her ideas changed in the decade after its publication. But some of the suggestions that were made to her for changes she didn't make, because she was quite clear that there were more books to write, and she kept on writing. So the things that she's doing in 1907, writing kind of as a spiritual director to Margaret, and reading the mystics, all combined to be part of the world that she was creating for herself. She has had an incredible ability, a really good ability to write, and really, really widely read in many languages. And looked at mysticism very differently. She looked at it as if it was something that was able to be accessible to ordinary people, that it was a real thing, not something that was just crazy people did or weird people did. She kind of sensed a way of separating out the real, in a sense, the real mystical experiences. And she clarified the different ways people experienced, and ultimately came to a shape or a pattern of their movement to that place of the mystical experiences. And she did it across mostly Western and European and British mystics, but she also looked at the work of the writings of Sufis and some Eastern writing. But mostly she found that Christian mysticism and Sufis as well, but Christian mysticism held a place in which the extremes that people were concerned about with mysticism were able to be contained. She also saw that mysticism was essentially very practical. And of course the charge against mystics is always that they're away with something or other on their own little journey and that it's all about themselves. But she argued really strongly with many, many examples of how the mystics were their journeys were within themselves, but also that they had a practical element, that they led to the reform of the church or the institution or to changes in the way of people's thinking. They were never doing it for their own sake or for the sake of the mystical experience. It was always for the sake of allowing the love found in the mystical experience to be shared and to be held on, passed on. This is the cover of one of the editions of Mysticism, one from the 1990s. The publishers have changed the title slightly. One of the things about reading Evelyn Underhill that can be quite difficult is her language. She uses the language from the early 1900s, and we are all men. And sometimes I found that quite irritating, trying to read her and like, I'm not a man. But what she has to say is far greater than the irritation. But what's interesting about the 1990s edition is the foreword by Ira Progoff, a psychologist. And she wonders why this book is deemed to be a theological work when, for her, as far as she is concerned, it's a psychology book. It's in that field of study. And I think that says something very important about Evelyn's approach to her work, that she didn't come with a package of institutional understanding. Well, she did really, but not a commitment to a theological position or an institutional position. The position she had, if it was anything, was a fondness for the way Catholicism did liturgy, and a way in which she could find within even when she couldn't go to the Mass, a sense of spiritual depth, those things which she feels that the clergy needed. She felt later that the clergy in the Anglican Church needed to be able to provide within the services. This is another part of that same letter. God is the interesting thing about religion, and people are hungry for God, but only a priest whose life is soaked in prayer, sacrifice and love can, by his own spirit of adoring worship, help us to apprehend God. She had an experience of wanting to join the Catholic Church, to become Catholic. She wasn't sure before that whether or not she was an atheist, so that's the kind of position she's coming from. She went for a while to a girls' boarding school, an Anglican boarding school, where she was confirmed, but otherwise mostly, and she did a little bit of university work, study, but otherwise she was self-educated or home-taught and self-educated. But she had great friendships. She was a very social person, had great friendships, and helped with the work of the librarian at the British Museum. And that relationship meant that she had access to quite a lot of books that weren't published. In her letters to Margaret Robinson, she's telling Margaret where she can get hold of translations of Teresa of Avila or Roysbrook and what others. During the period after the publication of Mysticism, she was busy doing too much other writing. Oh, the pattern of her day for writing started with an hour of contemplation in the beginning of the day, just a meditation leading into contemplation, and she describes that process in one of her letters to Margaret Robinson, and reminds her that it needs to be done regularly, and it needs to be done persistently and faithfully, even when it feels like nothing's happened. And those parts of her writings that describe that process are really quite important. And we will find the same kind of process described by Lawrence Freeman or Merton, and the same kind of relationship between the contemplative stance, the contemplative way, and the notion of action. You'll find that in Richard Rohr's Centre for Contemplation and Action. They have the same balance between the depth and the life in the world. So during the time between after the publication of this, the First World War happened, and she had a job during the war as in naval intelligence as a translator. I think she quite enjoyed the social life there, but it didn't stop her from continuing to write. But she was deeply affected and grieved by the war itself, and before the Second World War she had declared herself to be a pacifist. In that period too, she she had as a spiritual director, Baron von Hugel, and he, a Catholic with a very broad education himself, he'd been taught for a long period of time by an Anglican, he encouraged her to become connected with an institution. Her experience of almost joining the Catholic Church happened at around about the time she was married in 1907. She had a friend called Ethel Baker, with whom they secretly went, or she secretly went with Ethel to a retreat. And her experience there was quite deep and touched all those spiritual places which all the trips to Europe had also touched. But even in 1907, before her marriage, she was having discussions with her husband about whether or not she should become a Catholic. And she found a spiritual director in France with whom she debated this, because she was on the point of converting to Catholicism. But he didn't want her to become Catholic. Mixed marriages were a really big problem, were all the way through the first half of this century, the 19th century, 20th century. And he asked her to wait until after they were married. He felt very uncomfortable about her going to confession, and he felt a sense of the priest would stand in the gap between her. And they had quite, by the looks of the correspondence, they had quite open conversations about what this meant for her to give up becoming Catholic, and what it might mean for him. Her spiritual director, her French spiritual director, advised her to wait, and in the waiting, Pope Pius helped her. Pope Pius X helped her by issuing an encyclical against modernism, and given that she felt herself to be a modernist, she thought what that really meant was an encyclical against the study of the historical Jesus. So the literalism of the Bible was the thing that she was objecting to in what his statement was in his encyclical. So she didn't become Catholic, and then after the war she had another Catholic spiritual rector, Baron von Hugel, and he, in his letters to her, mostly they did spiritual direction through letters, advised her that she really needed to belong to an institution, that she couldn't keep going on with her writing and her life and her hungering for the Catholic liturgy and her inability to go to Mass, and she needed to be connected with an institution. And she had rejected the Anglican Church because she found it boring and unspiritual. And he engaged with her, as a good spiritual director would, I think, in a process of sticking with what's there, of persistence, of staying in, of making a commitment and being persistent, which is the advice she had given others in terms of their contemplative prayers and their spiritual life. And it caused her pain, but she did it. And in the process, she became part of the Anglican Church's ability to reflect about itself, because as her writings increased and more Anglicans read it, and more the impact of mysticism was quite powerful amongst many theologians, and her lectures on on mysticism at the university were also quite powerful. One of the things that the experiences which helped her on this path was going to Pleshy, which is a retreat centre in England. And having gone there and started then to be continuing her writing, she was invited to lead retreats. And in the leading of the retreats, as the writing of the book of mysticism helped her get all her ideas sorted out and worked through in a personal way, so did her retreat leading. And many of the books, there's quite a few of them here. Just here, if you want to have a little look at them. These are mostly books from Murdoch Library. Are books written from her retreats or her lectures. The one that you heard in our retreat up in New Norcia is The Spiritual Life. Had been a series of lectures given on the BBC, talks given at the BBC, which she then put into a book. So all this exploration of her own spirituality and the spirituality of others, and that desire for people to be enriched, she was doing through her writing and through her retreats. She would end up doing at least 2 retreats every year at Pleshy and others in various places, including retreats or a retreat at least, one to clergy and one to Anglican bishops. She was then also part of, joined one of the Anglican liturgical groups and gave advice. This book here, called The House of the Soul, is an example of the kind of retreats she ran, and the quite wonderful thing about her reflections and her retreats is the way in which she made what seems to be, she was changing her language from mysticism to spirituality. She made what seemed to be incredibly difficult understandings of big theological issues quite simple and practical. The abiding theme throughout her writing is that we are inhabitants of sensual people and inhabitants of an earthly realm, and also inhabitants of a heavenly realm. She described us as people needing to be like amphibious, like frogs, having grown up like tadpoles in a watery world, and then having to inhabit a world of both water and air. As with our souls, for example, as like little birds tied by a string on their foot who can't fly, because the soul longs to fly, and we keep it in our pettiness, attached by a string, however strong or weak, that prevents it from flying. And in The House of the Soul, she describes a house that's like upstairs, downstairs. I don't know, have any of you remember the upstairs, downstairs series?
Downton Abbey.
Downton Abbey, that has upstairs, downstairs, does it? And she says we tend to inhabit either the upstairs or the downstairs We might want to live forever in a mystical, perfect upstairs or in a very practical downstairs, but we can't be whole unless we live in the whole house. The house of the soul has to be the whole house. We can order, we can't live up there in that mystical space and not know whether the rubbish has been going out, and we can't live with all our attention on the practical world and not ever go upstairs. One of the little pieces of writing that I've handed out to you, it talks about people going to work on the tube and not taking any notice of anything around them. They're flipping through the news, flipping through the papers is one of her repeated kind of metaphors that she uses. Searching after crumbs without even realising there was a loaf. And she increasingly invited people to see God in all things, or God in accessible, God's voice speaking, and the soul really wanting to be nourished. And it was through that practical and accessible way of communicating that she reached many people through her writings, through her broadcasts, and through her retreats. But she was not just wanting it for its own sake, for us to have this connection between the heavenly realm and the world of the senses for our own sake. She wanted she wanted the churches to be able to be places where ordinary human folk could experience it. And in her later writings, she talks about the education of children and the need not to be telling kids what to do. And this is where her incredible openness comes, her ecumenism really comes into its strength when she talks about approaching the education of children not by telling them what they should think or by punishing them for what they don't know, but by listening to them and starting them off at a very early age, listening to them and allowing them and showing them primarily love. Because she says that's the way that God works. God works by showing love, by being love. A third piece from that word you've got, the letter that you have there. The two things that laity want from the priesthood are spiritual realism and genuine love of souls. It is by these that all Christian successes have been won in the past, and it is to these that men always respond. We instantly recognise those services and sermons that are the outward expression of the priest's interior adherence to God and the selfless love of souls. These always give us a religious experience. The last years of her life saw the publication of Worship and The Spiritual Life, the BBC talk which we heard at New Norcia. And they were marked by another paradigm shift, where the influence of the Russian Orthodox immigrants who came to England introduced her to the Holy Ghost. She had two friends, Bishop Frere and the Reverend Ward, I can't remember his first name. Ward introduced her to pacifism, and Frere invited her to come with him to an Orthodox church service. and she went quite regularly then to church services where she could, and she describes in one of her pieces going into what looked like on the outside just an ordinary old building, just a fairly rundown building on a street, and walking in and seeing this ordinary hall transformed, so that the experience of worship took you completely away from the building itself into the whole, and it was the way it was decorated, but it was also the liturgy itself, a way in which this whole place could transform one into a different world. And she also joined, although she was getting quite ill with asthma, attacks of asthma in this latter part of her life, but her experiences there of going to Orthodox services with the immigrants, Russian immigrants, really shifted her thinking about the importance and the place of Russian, of Orthodox theology. She eventually couldn't run too many retreats, but she kept on writing. She died in 1941, so she knew that the Second World War had started, and it gave her a lot of grief. She was also a person who really loved her cats, and she had a cat called Jacob, and she always had to send Jacob's love to Margaret Robertson in her letters to her. I just want to come to another one of these. Oh, that's. I had been thinking of kind of photocopying the contents of the book, but they're just so huge. The worship contents from worship, but they cover not just Christian worship, but also Jewish worship, and not just Catholic style worship, but Protestant. She looks at the Eucharist, but other elements of worship. Jewish worship, the early worship, the beginnings of the Free Church, the Reformed churches. And she has some positive things to say about Quaker worship as well, which is quite lovely. But one of the later paragraphs in that letter to Archbishop Lang, she says, "I know that recovering the ordered interior life of prayer and meditation will be very difficult for clergy immersed increasingly in routine work. It will mean for many a complete rearrangement of values and a reduction of social activities. They will not do it unless they are made to feel it is of crucial importance. This will not be achieved through schools of prayer, which stimulate the mind rather than the spirit. But the solemn voice of the United Episcopate, recalling the Church to that personal, realistic contact with the supernatural, which has been, since Pentecost, the one source of her power, will give authoritative support to those who already feel the need of a deeper spirituality, and will remind the others that the renewal of a spiritual society must depend on giving absolute priority to the spiritual life." One of the books of her letters is edited by edited with an introduction by Lumsden Barquay, Bishop of St Andrews, with Dumfries and Dunkeld. He was a few years younger than her and was absolutely and utterly enriched by reading her books. He became a bishop in London and was consecrated by Bishop Lang, Archbishop Lang. And then he went up and spent 10 years in Scotland in the St Andrews diocese. And it was at the St Andrews, or was it Aberdeen? Where she became, no, it was Aberdeen, where she became, where she was given an honorary doctorate. But she was never able to go up and receive the doctorate for herself because she was quite ill at the time. This was around about 1938 that she got that doctorate. His Lumsden Barclay is absolutely clear about the strength and importance of the effect of her writing on the church and the way the clergy and the people work. And I just really want to finish this section by taking us back to our first lecture, or our first teaching session of this semester, where Dr. Mark ended on a personal note. And he spoke of the joys and the problems of being from I kind of like to read it out, but I won't, of coming from the Pentecostal tradition. And I feel that this last paragraph or this particular paragraph of Evelyn's letter echoed for me some of what Mark was saying when he said, but for all its flaws, and they are legion, the tradition, the Pentecostal charismatic tradition, has furnished me with a belief in the sovereignty of God's Holy Spirit and her desire to make God known through many and varied ways. And I felt that was a perfect commentary on Evelyn Underhill's influence on the church and on many individual people as well. That's a photograph of that's still there in Pleshy. It's a crucifix which Evelyn brought back from Europe. She bought it in Europe, and she brought it and she donated it to, or gave it to Pleshy, and it's still there. And the little eternity framed picture at the top there is something she made herself, and it was in her writing room all her life. Towards the end of her days of writing in London, living in London, her asthma was so bad that her doctor ordered her to remove all the books from her library. Now, I know there's some bibliophiles here who might find that horrifying, but she had to remove all of her books and just bring in what she needed, what she was working on at the moment. So she spent some time in a kind of a denuded and emptied out space. It was also the space where the cats came and sat on her lap. And
that would have really helped her asthma.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. I don't know what the doctors thought then. But then she went to live in the country with some people a couple who, well, she and her husband moved there, where the couple helped with the writing so that she could keep on writing. That's an icon of her. And these are some, I'll read it out because I wasn't quite sure what to do with the second session. I've got too much for us to do in the second session. So one of the things we could do is discuss in small groups or in ones or twos the two-piece documents that you've got, or another option is to go through and look at this and ask, to respond to it. But I'll stop talking now and see if there's invite any questions. I don't know how we're going. Like, I know it's 11:50, but I don't know when I'm meant to stop. Now? Yeah, break now, or questions? People want to ask any questions now? Or?
How does she define mysticism?
Oh, I'd have to read you a bit of the book. I'd have to read out a bit of the book. I should have done that. I should have gotten a quote for that. I'll look it up, and because this is quite an important definition.
Change for her, because
yes.
As a theist.
Yes.
Kind of alone to the alone kind of thing. And then von Hugel's direction of her brings her more and more steadily to be a member of the community of faith and a Christocentric understanding of God. And she talks about that, whereas most people, Christians, come to God through Christ, she was the other way around. She was someone who came through God to Christ.
Yes.
So by the end of the last part of her life, she is bringing the riches of the Christian spiritual tradition, particularly, to empower ordinary Christians and ordinary clergy in the ways of Christian prayer and spirituality. It's quite amazing. Does that help?
I was just wondering, in fact, almost in line with what Rowan was saying, and in terms of the reading that we've been doing and we've been talking this morning, when she came to a Trinitarian position, how did she do so? What was kind of Trinitarian? I mean, I can see a theistic position here. I can see, particularly, she's sees and draws things from Sufi mysticism, for example. But where does the Trinitarianism for her enter in?
Well, as far as I see, and I'm not a theologian, the Spirit was always there, but I think it was just not an acknowledgement that that was what it was. You know, when she talks about, you know, the voice inviting the soul into communion. I mean, but Rowan, can you answer that?
Well, in a sense, she starts with God the Father, although she, the theist, doesn't see him as God the Father yet. Von Hugel brings her to the reality of God the Son, Christ. And in the last about 3 years of her life, when she encounters the Orthodox, it kind of blows her brain and her soul, and she encounters God the Holy Spirit as a reality. So she encounters each of them in one sense, just not exactly discreetly, but as a dimension of her life which comes to the fore at various stages of her life. And by the end, she's able to write material and undertake prayer, which is incredibly Trinitarian because she's had all of those three, in a sense, dimensions and realises their unity.
So in the first edition of mysticism, the language is sometimes she uses the word God or the Christian God, but she also talks about what Christ does in the lives of those mystics who are Christian mystics. But she also calls God reality or absolute, and that allows her then not to make any distinction between the ultimate of the Sufis or Jewish people or others, so that for her there is a divine absolute that incomprehensible, yes, but who desires to be known and is love. So in a sense, the Christian God is there in the package, but not named as so until she says that the Christian, the God of the Christians, holds those mystics in a different space and in a different way, and does it, obviously if it's John of the Cross, does it in a very painful way, but but there is some holding within the institution. Like it's not like John of the Cross just goes off and starts his own religion, or that Teresa, in starting new Carmelite places, wants them to be not Christian. She recognises the role of Christ in their lives and what it means to them. So it's not like, and when she wants to join the Catholic Church, the thing, it's the spiritual experience and the spirituality in the liturgy and in the contemplative experiences she has. But it's also the Eucharist. I mean, the thing that becomes most painful for her is that she can go, while she's under spiritual direction with either Bernard or Hegel, that she can go to church, but she can't take the Eucharist. So there's something, even though she's not, it's why I think the books transform her or teach her, or God teaches her through her own writing, as I think God does really teach us all through our own writing, that there is something more she needs, that it's not enough just to have a mystical experience. She knows that having the mystical experience for its own sake is not of any value. It has to come back to something, and she sees in Jesus Christ an action. But then she sees in the Eucharist, and this is why she becomes quite Anglo-Catholic, there is something that happens in the Eucharist that is significant, because the Christ offers himself absolutely and utterly to the Father. She does a retreat called Abba on the Lord's Prayer, and she holds that as a very important prayer. She does another retreat on the Creed. So these are all. So she's coming there, but it's not really until the experience with the Orthodox Russians that she, like the Holy Spirit actually, it's like a revelation of what that means to her. So her definition of mysticism is to do with the experience with the divine, and it's a thing in itself, but it's not on its own. Time for a break? 10-minute break?